Okay, appreciate it. Don't worry, all my questions it's on right here. It's been on. I'm always wrong with his questions. There is no right answer. There. So I'm constantly trying to connect the dots between different pieces of scripture, and I think Psalms 83, Joel 3, and Isaiah 63 and Obadiah 1 all go together very nicely when we're talking about the last days and what we can expect to happen right before Christ returns. So I wanted to cover a little bit more with this, but you can sort of see why you can kind of see why we're looking at these countries and why we're looking at these current events when you consider Psalms 83, Isaiah 63, which is the man coming up with dyed garments, and Joel 3, which is God bringing all the nations who hate Israel back to be judged. So those three, and Obadiah 1, which talks about the wiping out of the entire house of Edom, all kind of go together. We talked about this a little bit last time, that Psalms 83, Joel chapter 3, Isaiah 63. We can read them together so that we get a better picture of this. I just kind of wanted to state the obvious because I don't want people to feel like we're just doing current events. I'm like, but there's a reason we're doing current events. And then these chapters, if you read them as your homework assignment, will help you figure that out. So if I could have a reader, we can do Psalms 83 first. And this tells you the who. It lines up the nations that are involved, because it talks about who they're going to be that are involved in this, starting at verse 6, 7, and 8. Those are the ones that are, and there's more that are referenced back in Israel's history, but those are the ones, 6, 7, and 8, tell you the who. So we'll start reading with, let's see, I guess.
The tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites of Moab and the Hagarenes, and Gebal and Ammon and Amalek and the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also has joined with them. They have holpen the children of Lot. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin at the brook of Kishon.
Very good. So if we want to, we can read the whole chapter real quick. Brad, do you want to start us off? You can just read it, and I guess you can reread or skip the ones that Jesse just did, because those are we just got to talk about what nations those are. I should have put up maps today for that.
Keep not your silence, O God. Hold not your peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, your enemies make a tumult. They that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people and consulted against your hidden ones. They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against you. 6, 7, and 8 we just read. I'll pick up at 9. Do unto them as unto the Midianites, as to Sisera, as to Jabin at the brook of Kishon, which perished at Endor. They became as dung for the earth. They make their nobles like Oreb and like Zeb, yea, all their princes as Zebah and as Zalmunna, who said, let us take to ourselves the house of God in possession. O my God, make them like a wheel, as the stubble before the wind, as fire burns a wood, as the flame sets the mountains on fire. So persecute them with your tempest, and make them afraid with your storm. Fill their faces with shame, that they may seek your name, O Lord. Let them be confounded and troubled forever. Yes, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that you, whose name alone is Yahweh, are the Most High over all the earth.
Great, thank you very much. So I want you to pay attention to verse 12 where it says, "Make them like tumbleweed, my God, before the straw and the wind. The fire burns before us as the flame blazes through the mountain. So pursue them with your tempest and with your storm." That goes back to the original promise made by God in Genesis chapter 15, where he divides the animals and the torch and the fire pan go through the pieces, right? It's also picked up again in Zechariah chapter 13, where he says, "I will make Jerusalem a burdensome stone, a torch and a fire pit that burns everything in its path." So it's just really interesting when we look at these different chapters, because there isn't just one war when Christ comes back. There is a series of wars, and having discernment to separate those wars based on intent, based on geography and location, as well as who is involved and why, are kind of the four questions you need to ask when you're looking at the wars post Christ's return. So Armageddon, for instance, is not the same thing as the Valley of Jehoshaphat. They're separate. So trying to link up the passages that go together is really important. So we just saw the elements, so keep your finger here, and let's go over to Joel chapter 3 and read in here. But I just want you to remember that that fire that is existing, like I said, goes back to Genesis 15 and to Zechariah 13, where it says, "I'm going to make Jerusalem a burdensome stone, a torch, and a fire pan." It's going to set them all on fire like sheaves. So we're building up to this moment, and these nations' rumblings are little earthquakes that we can see that are bringing the pieces together. So we may ask over and over again, why are we even talking about Ukraine? Because there's a lot of Jews there that can be returned to the land. The estimate is between 50,000 and 200,000. There was a lot more there during World War II that were taken out. So this game playing that's going on between Russia and the rest of the world, just like World War II, the real significance is what happened to the Jews. World War I cleared the land for the Jews to return. World War II brought the people back to the land. These conflicts are going to bring the very last remnants, hopefully, back home. I was trying to look up how many Jews are in Taiwan in case China takes that. It's a very small population, but they still are there. So just be thinking about how is God going to move these chess pieces to accomplish what we see in these passages. So Joel 3, can we get a reader for that? Go ahead, Casey.
The whole chapter?
Yeah, that'd be great.
In those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will put them on trial for what they did to my inheritance, my people Israel, because they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. They cast lots for my people and traded boys for prostitutes. They sold girls for wine to drink.
It's up there for a second. So this is the charge that God is giving in this instance. He's bringing them into judgment because of how they treated his people, how they scattered them and mistreated them. In 83, we saw who we were talking about, and it was Moab, it was Edom, it was all their typical enemies that are around them and what they did to them. And so this charge is very specific, and it's targeted towards the people who did these crimes against Israel. Think about Nuremberg. Nuremberg was what? It was a court trial against the Nazis and what they did to the Jews. This is God's Nuremberg. He is bringing these people into judgment. Where? In the valley of Jehoshaphat, not Nuremberg. And he's going to try them for all the things they did to his people. So we have to put it sometimes in a modern context to understand it a little bit better. Go ahead, Casey.
Now what have you against me, Tyre and Sidon, and all you regions of Philistia? Are you repaying me for something I've done? If you're paying me back, I will swiftly and speedily return on your own heads what you have done. For you took my silver and my gold and carried off my finest treasures to your temples. You sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks, that you might send them far from their homeland. See, I'm going to rouse them out of the places to which you sold them, and I will return on your own heads what you've done. I will sell your sons and daughters to the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabaeans, a nation far away. The Lord has spoken. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for war. Rouse the warriors. Let all the fighting men draw near and attack. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weakling say, I am strong. Come quickly, all you nations, from every side, and assemble there. Bring down your warriors, Lord. Let the nations be roused. Let them advance into the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the nations on every side. Swing the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, trample the grapes, for the winepress is full, and the vats overflow, so great is their wickedness. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision. For the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and moon will be darkened, and the stars no longer shine. The Lord will roar from Zion and thunder from Jerusalem. The earth and the heavens will tremble, but the Lord will be a refuge for his people, a stronghold for the people of Israel. Then you will know that I, the Lord your God, dwell in Zion, my holy hill. Jerusalem will be holy. Never again will foreigners invade her. In that day, the mountains will drip new wine, and the hills will flow with milk. All the ravines of Judah will run with water. A fountain will flow out of the Lord's house and will water the valley of acacias. But Egypt will be desolate, Edom a desert waste, because of violence done to the people of Judah, in whose land they shed innocent blood. Judah will be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem through all generations. Shall I leave their innocent blood unavenged? No, I will not. The Lord dwells in Zion.
Thank you very much. So part of that is the Edomites, whenever Israel had a bad turn of events, they ran in to take the spoil. They ran in to help cause the situation to be worse for the people when they went to captivity in Babylon. They sold them to the Greeks as slaves. In every instance, they did whatever they could to be a catalyst to cause more destruction to them. I sort of think of them like being like France. You know, during World War II, they voluntarily rounded up their Jews to give to the Germans to put in concentration camps. It wasn't a forced thing. It was something they chose to do. And it was a very ugly thing to do. So let's go to Isaiah chapter 65. Sorry, 63, excuse me. So we just read about God bringing all the nations into this giant vat, and these grapes are going to be crushed. We see the exact same language here in Isaiah 63. So here it's talking about this day of vengeance, also against the nations, also with the charge of what they have done to God's people. So can I have a reader for Isaiah 63? Go ahead, Robbie. Let's see. Let's read to, actually we only need to read to verse 6.
Who is this that comes from Edom with dyed garments from Bozrah? This one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Why is your apparel red, and your garments like one who treads in the winepress? I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the people no one was with me. For I have trodden them in my anger, and trampled them in my fury. Their blood is sprinkled upon my garments, and I have stained all my robes. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come. I looked, but there was no help, and I wondered, and there was no one to uphold. Therefore my own arm brought salvation for me, and my own fury, it sustained me. For I have trodden down the peoples in my anger, made them drunk in my fury, and brought down their strength to the earth.
So keep your finger here and look again at Joel 3. What similarities of language do you see? With the metaphor of the winepress, with the enemies, with the charge against these nations, there is a lot to see. You can put up chart after chart of how they all fit together. but the language is very, very close to what we're saying. Okay, so these are the things that we're interested in and why we're waiting for Christ's imminent return. It's different than Armageddon. That's down the line after this event. And everybody kind of, if you'll forgive me, misuses Ezekiel 38 and 39 a lot because they expect that to be the next event with Russia. I've talked about it with Harold before he died, and Tanner Hawkins and everybody else, and it's like in my estimation, there are 13 qualifiers in that chapter that tell you it happens during the kingdom age. It can't happen now because none of those things are true. If you go with me there for just a second, I'll give you just a couple examples. So it's Ezekiel, I believe, 39. Actually, 38 is where I'll start. So this is got a lot of these different countries. Persia, Put, and Gomer, and Beth Tarmagog from the remotest parts that are coming down. And starting at verse 7 and 38, it says, "Be prepared and get yourself ready, you and all of your company, and who have mobilized around you. You will be there on their guard. After a long time," which is condition number 1, "you'll be summoned. In the last days you will enter the land that has been restored from war." Israel is pretty much since 1948 been in a semi-continuous state of war, either with the terrorists who are attacking them or with other nations, such as the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the Independence War, and so many other skirmishes that have gone on. Number 2, they're restored from war and regathered from the many peoples to the mountain of the Lord. That's still going on. That's characteristic number 3. There's about 7 million in Israel, 6 in the United States, and another 6 million around the rest of the world right now, which has long been a ruin. So this war that's spoken about in Zechariah chapter 14 kind of has to happen before they get restored from war of devastation like it's going to be. They were brought out of your peoples, and all of them will now live in security. If people try to make that analogy, oh, they're dwelling in security now, I'm like, no, they're not. There are more walls in Israel than they've ever had in their history, going around all of the protected areas in Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. So we don't see that. You and all of your troops and many of your people will be advancing, coming like a thunderstorm. They will cover the land. This is what the Lord says. On that day, thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will devise an evil plan. You will say, I will go up against a land of open villages. Is that true of Israel today? Not one of their villages are open. They're all closed with security, with walls, with iron dome, with all these other things. I will come against the tranquil people who are living securely, and all of them without walls and without bars and without gates. None of that is true today. When I was working for GSA in Washington, we were putting in protective glass in the Pentagon. It's a kind of glass that was made in Israel. It's blast-proof. They have test shots, you can watch them on YouTube, where they blow up something outside of the building, the windows bow in, and they come right back. And those were made in Israel. Where did we use them? On the very side of the Pentagon when 9/11 happened, that they came in. It was a slice through the building. You see none of the other windows broken out in any of that footage because it's glass. When you're inside, it looks like the Emerald City. Everything outside is totally green because that's the kind of glass that they have. So Israel is still making these things. Do women have to serve in the Israeli military? Yup-a-doodle. Do they have to do that in the United States? No, they don't have to. It's all voluntary. So these are not a people living securely at all. Nobody can make that case. To carry off plunder and turn your enemies upon the ruins that are now inhabited and against a people gathered from all the nations who have been acquiring cattle and possessions and who live at the center of the world. We always think that's Ashland, Virginia, the center of the universe. However, it's going to be Jerusalem. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all their rulers will ask, have you come to take a spoil? Have you assembled all your herds to carry off plunder, to make off with silver and gold and cattle and possessions of great spoil? Who does everybody say this is every time you talk? What is Russia and all her allies coming to Israel to take away? And they always say oil. And I'm like, they've got all the oil they want. They're exporting it through Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, plus other pipelines. They don't need Israel's natural gas and oil. What are they coming for? It's the wealth of all the nations. Go to the end of Zechariah 14. Starting at verse 16. Judah will also fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be collected, gold, silver, and clothing in great abundance. The same plague of the previous one will strike the horses and mules and camels and donkeys and all the animals that are in those camps. So the wealth of all the nations, according to Zechariah 14, is coming to Jerusalem, to a theater near you. And when that happens, this is when Gog and Magog and all of their allies will come to take a spoil, not of natural gas and oil, but because all the wealth of all the nations has been brought to Jerusalem. It makes much more sense than what we've been told, that this is the next event that's going to happen. And there are 13 qualifiers in Ezekiel 38 that tell you clues. We're always asking for when, and I'm like, the clues are right there. We need to consider the 13 that are there so that we know when are these events going to happen. This is obviously describing which time in Ezekiel 38. Is it now or in the kingdom age? It's got to be, because there's no bars, there's no windows, the people are not trained for war, they're living peace and in tranquil, they're not have cities with walls, none of that. Right now, it's the inverse, completely the inverse, and I'm just amazed there are those who would try to twist these scriptures to fit our time, and I'm like, it doesn't fit at all. It's like a puzzle piece that will never fit. So when we're studying these current events, we're looking at these chess pieces being changed. Yes, David?
The first battle then.
It's the ones in Psalms 83, the immediate nations around them.
I think it's just the Arabs there.
Right, and here's my comparison. If you were going to Latvia and talk about the Civil War, they would probably think the Civil War was one battle, wouldn't they? Because they don't know our history. We know that the Civil War was thousands of battles spread out from New Mexico all the way to different parts of Pennsylvania, New York. It was all over the United States, and it took 5 years to go through that. So this is the same way. It's going to take Christ a long time to conquer all the nations, and we know that from Daniel, we know that from all the other places. It's not one battle, it's over, the kingdom's here. As a matter of fact, I'd make a case that why couldn't David build his temple during his lifetime? There's two answers to this. Because I know that what everybody's going to say. Go ahead.
He was a man of war.
Yeah. Who said that?
God himself said that.
David said it. God never said it. In the chapter where it's read, he actually says, I'm going to build you a house, David. I'm going to make sure your house is never lost. In Solomon's letter to King Hiram, he says, you know why my father could not build the house. Because God had not given rest to all of his enemies. So the point is this. Were you allowed to cut stone at the site of the temple construction? No. Why? Exactly. Everything was prefab. There was no sound of the chisel or the hammer at the temple site. Those stones were prepared ahead of time, and they were brought to fit exactly where. And we're told we are those stones, and we are going to make up that temple. But more importantly, Solomon had to build it during a time of absolute peace so that there was no war going on. In the same way, when Christ returns, he is going, and you just follow the passage from beginning to end where it says, I will make your enemies a footstool for your feet. He says it in so many different places in Scripture, all the way up to Revelations, and that phrase helps us understand he's got to defeat the nations and then build the temple, and he will. But we always think of it as like a snap thing. Christ comes, he resurrects the dead, he builds a temple, he defeats all the nations. These are going to be things that take time. We don't know how long, but the reason why we look at these current events is to help us understand how close we are, who the players are, how they're involved in what we see in Psalms 83, Joel 3, and several of the others. Yes?
Just as I've grown through the last few years in my own studies, the pioneer brethren, when they wrote about these things, Dr. Thomas, Brother Roberts, they lived in a time where Israel was only talking about coming back. And they
Right.
thought it was going to, if you go by the verses, it sounds like it snowballs. Once they come back and they are unwalled villages, and we were all raised on that concept. But the pioneer brethren never foresaw 2 world wars, Persian Gulf War, Seventh Day War, all these things that had to happen. They actually thought that the kings of the East were the saints. It turned out to be a whole bunch of nations forming around the Levant, and all those things. That as time has gone on, we've learned that there's more to this that fills in a lot of spaces that they could not have foreseen, but yet we were raised on that older, less informed information.
I think
That's my understanding from where I've come.
the important thing is to be able to think independently and prove from Scripture and look at it critically, and it takes all of us to do that, because we all have to keep looking at these passages and try to link up the common language that fits between them and determine, are we looking at Isaiah 63, Joel 3, and Psalms 83? Is that the next event that's happening, or is it Ezekiel 38? And we know this is going to be a series of wars that are going to happen, one right after the other. But the initial war that brings Christ's return is what we're looking for, right? We're not as interested in the wars 40 or 50 years into Christ being on this earth. We want to know what's going to be the triggers that initiate the first war that happens in Israel. And as Christadelphians, we've always been searching and looking for these things. And these current events are supposed to help us sort of see how the chess pieces are being moved by God. And the chess pieces are nations. And God is moving them exactly where he wants them to be to accomplish his mission. So I think it's just important for us to focus on the right things. But again, if you'd like to look at it, there's 13 qualifiers in chapter 38 that describe the conditions of Israel when this war will happen. And none of them, not one of those 13, are true today. They all may be in the kingdom age, but it's not now. So, and I only know this because, I happen to work for the Navy, and I know what we've done to help them, know what their weapon systems are, and it's actually, some of it is in here. But I just wanted to say that the Prime Minister of Israel, again, is trying to get the Israelis out as soon as he can. We read this slide last time, I think. I wanted to get to this. So Israel is trying to walk a tightrope right now. I mean, literally down the middle of nations. So they're trying not to criticize what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Why? Yeah, and because they got to get the Jews out of Ukraine. So they're trying to keep a low profile, which is unlike them because of this is happening. And also because they're continuing with their strikes in Syria to knock out weapons that have been supplied through Iran. So would anybody like to read what's on the left? Go ahead, Randy.
There were no reports of any Syrian anti-aircraft missiles launched against the alleged Israeli attack. Syria said Israel struck several targets near Damascus overnight, hours after Russia's defense minister met there with President Bashar Assad. The Syrian Defense Ministry said that several targets in the town of Zakia were hit at around 11:35 p.m. with several surface-to-surface missiles launched from the Israeli Golan Heights, causing material damage but no deaths or injuries. There were no reports that any Syrian anti-aircraft missiles were launched against the alleged Israeli attack. It was the second time in 2 weeks that Israel has been accused of carrying out attacks in the Damascus area.
Are the Israelis doing this for fun, or is it a preventative measure? They have the intelligence to know that these weapons are being brought in from Iran to give them to either Iranian or other hostile forces in Syria, because Syria is a mess right now. So they're continuing these strikes, but look how close to the edge they've played this. You had the defense minister of Russia right there just a short time before this thing was launched. So it's pretty serious. Santa reported last week that the air defenses were activated against Israeli attack near the capital. At least one penetrated Israeli airspace and set off incoming rocket alerts in and El Fam in the towns northwest of the West Bank. The rockets exploded in midair with shrapnel falling in the Jenin area, and the response of the anti-aircraft missiles, Israeli Air Forces struck a number of surface-to-air missiles batteries belonging to the Syrian military, including one which fired towards the jets. The one soldier was killed and 5 others were wounded. Israel has been striking targets in war-torn country for close to a decade through its war between wars campaign against the Iranian entrenchment and weapons smuggling and Hezbollah, with hundreds of airstrikes in Syria. So, yeah.
Picture of Iron Dome.
Yes, okay, it is. I'm going to show you. So this is the one that just happened.
That's an actual picture of Syria.
Yes, in Damascus, where it was struck. It's from this news report.
Okay, because there is a missile going up, so that's why I was curious.
Right.
Okay, thanks.
And I'll skip down to you had a question.
I was just, well, not a question, I was just gonna make a point. I don't remember what day it was this past week, but Russia came out and told Israel to stop, firing missiles into Syria. I didn't look into it too deeply, but, they've thrown down the flag. Okay, you're done doing this. But if we're well aware of how Israel is, just because they've been told not to do something doesn't mean they're gonna stop.
No.
They're ultimately looking out for their own interests. They're gonna, regardless of the fact that they have Jews in the Ukraine still, and Russia's hovering over that.
Right.
They see it as that's their job to do in Syria, is to protect themselves.
Exactly. So it's a fine line, a fuzzy line, if you will, because Israel hasn't been told no by Russia or the U.S. They're trying to protect. I mean, it'd be like if Mexico decided to put a bunch of missiles on their border and fire into the United States day and night, day and night, day and night, and we just kept striking them back. But in Israel, to fight for survival. So this Iron Dome defense system, this is how it works, and it's very important. We have helped fund this. It's short-range rockets, 155 millimeter shells ranging up to 70 kilometers, so they got to put it near their borders. And the launchers each has 20 interceptor missiles with a built-in radar seeker, so it seeks out the missiles and destroys them. And then there's an analysis trajectory in this mobile control unit. It estimates impact points and command launches and interceptor missiles. So it's very sophisticated. Several mobile batteries, including unknown locations. Each missile costs $50,000. So, I mean, every time they do one of these things, there's $50,000 going out the window. Yes?
This isn't the only thing they have. They also have, I think, David Sling as well as another instrument that they use for different ranges of missiles and other types of devices.
They have a ton of different weapon systems. This is describing what strikes outside the country if they're affected. So Iron Dome is over the whole country, and they have all these different ways of dealing with incoming rocketry and stuff. I wanted to see. It's going to start playing. Hold on. I want to escape. So, and I need the sound for the next one anyway. I'm going to go really fast. Hold on a second. I want to get down there. It's okay. No, you're good. I just wanted to show these two videos really quickly. This is one you sent me.
Today on the newscast, how would a Russian invasion of Ukraine embolden China, Iran, and other anti-Western regimes? Find out next. Hey folks, Eric Stackelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman newscast. The Russia-Ukraine crisis continues to heat up, and the big question now, of course, is will Russia invade? White House officials here in the U.S. are saying that an invasion could happen any day now. Russia has some 130,000 troops massed on its borders with Ukraine, surrounding Ukraine from three sides. And now we have diplomats from various countries, including the United States, evacuating Ukraine, embassies being evacuated, again, as an invasion, according to Western officials, is imminent. Will Russia go through with it? On the surface, it clearly appears that way. But what if Vladimir Putin is playing a different game here and possibly just extorting Ukraine and the West to get concessions and get some of what he wants, even without invading? Of course, the main goal for Putin would be to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. He's made clear from the beginning that that is a non-starter for him. He does not want Ukraine to attain NATO membership, and he wants all NATO troops pulled out of Eastern Europe. I think of Romania, Bulgaria in particular. What if Putin, just by sheer threats and massing and mobilizing troops and menacing Ukraine, what if he is able to get what he wants without firing a shot? Who knows if that will be the case again?
That's a great point he's making there, because he hasn't done anything except to mash a bunch of troops along the border. If he gets his way out of this, it'll be amazing. Yes. Real quick, 'cause we're almost out of time.
I weightlift with a fellow whose hobby is an amateur sniper. And he's very into that. That's why he weightlifts, to be fit for that competition.
Yeah.
He does. On the sniper chat rooms, they said that they've got all of the snipers out there have killed hundreds of Russian troops. Each individual sniper has.
Okay. Well, that's cool. Yeah, no, it's interesting.
And sadly, an invasion looks imminent, but the extortion strategy has worked very well for the Iranian regime. Just look at what's unfolding right now in Vienna, folks, as the United States and Western powers are very eager and very ready and willing to agree to a new nuclear deal with the Iranian regime. Now, what has Iran given? What concessions has Iran's leadership made in order to get this deal? What have they brought to the table? Absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, about a week and a half ago, the Biden administration, as we laid out here in the newscast last week, unilaterally lifted sanctions on Iran's so-called civilian nuclear program and unfroze overseas bank accounts worth some $29 billion belonging to the Iranian regime. And again, Iran gave nothing in return. This was a purely unilateral move by the United States in an effort to entice Iran's ayatollahs to agree to a nuclear deal. And guess what? It may happen. Why do I say it is a case of extortion? Well, throughout these Iran nuclear talks, going back even before the restart in November 2021, but to last spring, throughout these talks, Iran, through its proxies, has been causing mayhem in the Middle East and, yes, targeting U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria. On one hand, Iranian diplomats are at the negotiating table in Vienna, and on the other hand, Iran is supplying, funding, arming terror groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, and those Shia militias in Iraq and Syria that are maiming, killing, murdering across the Middle East. What they're saying, in essence, to the United States and the West is, if you don't give us what we want, we will make your lives miserable. We will cause chaos in the Middle East. We will continue to target American citizens in Syria and Iraq. If you give us what we want, maybe we'll back off. And the West is all too willing to rush into this deal and appease the Iranian regime and give it exactly what it wants. So if Vladimir Putin is watching the Iran model, the Iran example, he is going to continue to push. Iran has continued to push. They have not backed off an inch, even as these nuclear talks are unfolding in Vienna. That is the lesson of Vienna that Vladimir Putin can take, number one. Number two, he and Chinese Premier Xi Jinping and the mullahs in Iran certainly took lessons from the Afghanistan debacle back in August 2021. We've called it here the Afghanistan effect on the newscast, and the disastrous U.S. withdrawal, the show of weakness on the world stage, made America's enemies and the enemies of the West and the free world pretty certain that if push came to shove and, say, Russia wanted to move on Ukraine, China on Taiwan, or Iran and its proxies moving against Israel, there is a very good chance that America's current leadership and the West in general will do very little in response other than offer up some tough economic sanctions and some diplomatic protests. So there you have it. The Afghanistan effect has had a ripple effect, and now we're looking at a possible Ukraine effect. Whether Putin invades or doesn't invade, he will certainly gain some of what he wants. And what does he want? He wants broader Russian influence, a revival of those Soviet glory days. It's pretty simple. He's moving closer to China, by the way.
I'll stop it there. Jacob sent me this video. I'll be glad to send it to you, but it's excellent as a summation of what's going on in Israel right now. So thank you for your time. I know we need to stop for Sunday school.